Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 PM GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. We've done some extraordinarily interesting shows lately. Do please listen to the one we did on Wednesday last week, which is in the archive there, The Man Who Saw the Future. It's really relevant to what's happening now, and it's very relevant to things we talk about. We were in Herefordshire yesterday. I think we've got somebody from that talk listening in chat. It's good to have people in the chat, actually, because some people listen on Spreaker, a lot of people listen on YouTube, which we'd prefer they didn't, because we've had so many of our great videos taken off YouTube and restricted on YouTube. And every time we challenge the official narrative of the climate change policy agenda, we get a Wikipedia banner informing everybody that global temperatures are rising. Well, that's very good of Wikipedia, isn't it? Also, Wikipedia has been used to smear many people, including myself actually, to radical fake left middle-class Marxist propagandists and lobbyists who work for, well, let's say big money, have put stuff on me about there which is totally untrue, and I try and get it off, and then I can't do it. They say I'm vandalising the page. So Wikipedia is now actually begging for money. So please don't give them any. Let it die, and let's go back to real sources of information. Well, just thought I'd start off with that. This show is called Academia and the Hive Mind. Basically, it's the death of the mind. I mean, I've quoted in the past from a book called The Psychological Society. It was written by a fellow called Peter Gross in 1979. And it was an in-depth study on the explosion of psychology, which gave rise to a whole new era of neurosis, which became this parasitical industry, like basically run by charlatans and based on false and exaggerated assumptions. The book was mainly focused on this sort of flawed ideas of Sigmund Freud and the infliction of his sort of personal mental illness on the population and the birth of the industry of psychoanalysis, which came out of this. Now, to me, the only genius on display here was the ability of the analyst to charge money for listening to someone for an hour without having to exhibit any insight or useful advice, which is what this kind of psychoanalysis ended up as. It was basically you'd go to your psychiatrist and lie on the sofa and basically rabbit on about what you wanted, and they would sit there smoking a pipe or scratching their chin. It's really funny the way he describes it, and that's actually what Freud gave birth to, apart from, of course, lots of non-useful kind of descriptions of mental conditions that didn't really exist. Well, you've got to create them. That's the whole point. It's an industry. So, the book started with this statement, which I really like. It said, the citizens of the Psychological Society are the most anxious, emotionally insecure and analysed population in the history of mankind. A new model of Westerner dependent on others as to what is real or false. It is an art, science, therapy, religion, moral code, lifestyle, philosophy and cult. Its professional minions number in the hundreds of thousands. That was in 1979. There's many millions of them now. Psychology, therefore, is an establishment-approved cult. The use of psychology in all its forms is a useful tool for the destruction of thinking and to shut down sense. And we're seeing that more and more in the post-truth era, which is the one we're living in at the moment. But the introduction of neurosis through psychology and its use as a weapon by the state has been well used in most totalitarian systems. They simply create a mental illness and diagnose those who are a problem to them. The victims then accept that they need to be reprogrammed and act accordingly, and those who don't are drugged and kept in secure institutions and can be disposed of when convenient. Actually, somebody contacted me recently. I've done some work with a group called Speaking Out Against Psychiatry, which is linked, obviously. It's the pharmaceutical arm of what happens when people are victims of these people who have studied what they think is human behaviour but isn't. And yeah, very interesting that I've actually been sent a video of somebody who had the police there to section him, and his arguments against the police would mean to any psychologist or psychiatrist that he was perfectly sane, but that didn't stop them carting him off. I don't know what the exact circumstances were, so I won't comment further, but I'm just making a point there. The totalitarian systems have always used psychiatry and the threat of being mentally ill against the host, the populations of the countries. So yeah, basically, a simpler version of this is just to demonise any factual evidence with the weaponised military intelligence terms such as, yes, here we go, right-wing conspiracy theory, or compare a fact to something unconnected and discredited along with unsubstantiated arguments. That's the other thing, using what they call logical fallacies. And that is rife and rampant in every fake argument that is presented to us these days. Yes, the other very useful established cult that we're going to talk about tonight is that of the academic priesthood. Academia, yeah. It is the intellectual cul-de-sac where the state keeps its repeaters and administrators. Once the word expert is imposed on those who have read and repeated enough information without question, then they're ready to be used as a weapon of the state against the public. The lack of credibility of these state weapons against any expansion of knowledge cannot be addressed, as you cannot possibly know as much as they do because they're experts. The word expert is used so much these days, it's unbelievable. I mean, it goes into everything, doesn't it? I mean, the funniest ones are these sort of retired military people who are obviously very red-faced and have had too much port and get interviewed when there's a terrorist attack and they go, well, it bears all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. This kind of thing is absolutely hilarious, but then it filters down to these rather insidious people who are just lying through their teeth because they're careerists. We're going to get into some of that tonight as well. But yeah, the lack of credibility of these state weapons against any expansion of knowledge cannot be addressed, as you cannot possibly know as much as they do. That's the point. They, after all, are qualified to say what they are in fact merely repeating. Repetition is accepted as fact through repetition by the majority because the word expert is used. And this is the thing, it's like the Roman Church declared it was called unam sanctum. And it stated, there is one universal church of the faithful, outside of which there is absolutely no salvation. There is no salvation outside the official narrative, the accepted narrative, and that goes for everything that happens in the UK. So, the lowest things reach the highest place by intermediaries. This is what they stated. We declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff, just to re-emphasise the first point there. Now, we're all subject to the priests of the soundbite and the parasites of academia. Academics are the new indoctrinated priesthood, who are also very often wrongly referred to as these experts. So the word expert is so overused it has no real meaning. It's now the description of someone who has learned and repeated a propaganda narrative, as far as the media is concerned. Then, when we get the expert on TV, on a TV news channel, their expertise seems to be a repetition of the accepted narrative. Now, who would have thought, the idea of a TV debate now is just to set up two arguments which in reality have nothing to do with the outcome. That's the main thing. Most of these arguments that you get on media are completely false. They're nothing to do with the actual issue. This is a fascinating thing, and it goes into the way that people's minds have been absolutely programmed through television. I think this is fascinating, actually, because most people cannot debate a point. They will debate an issue or something to do with identity politics, which has nothing to do with the central point. But the new priest class are in the main bought and paid liars who they've been chosen and put on public display. And basically all those chosen and put on display have been effectively compromised and neutered. They are chosen for their compliance and fear of the unknown, along with a lack of ability for problem solving and insight. I found this absolutely key with academics. And as Jacques Ellul said in the book Propaganda, academics are the most susceptible to propaganda because they have access to a lot of information, they have an opinion on everything, and they are reinforcers of the state narrative because the state narrative actually reinforces their existence. So it's a mutual benefit. So academics cannot be fully trusted. And most of them are completely inept, in my experience, when it comes to real argument. So this is another really interesting point. Yes, those who think big do know how to control the majority with these clueless repeaters called experts and academics. It's not difficult with the public dependent on just two news agencies. We've got Reuters and Associated Press and Associated Foreign Press. Pretty much everything comes through them and then goes into basically agencies and PR companies. So taking this a step further, we now do not even need academics, because we have TV experts, don't we? Like when we see the likes of David Attenborough, who's basically a script-reading TV presenter who has no depth of knowledge and repeats propagandized statements with insincere gravitas. The illusion of even a smattering of knowledge has been surpassed by the use of a camera and a microphone. There are so many of these promoted mediocrities that the public now believe that these show business puppets are actually experts. Some of them even put doctor in front of their names, and that reinforces it further, even though their doctorate has nothing to do with what they're talking about. This goes into the whole climate change agenda with the use of people who are called scientists by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a lobbying arm of UN global governance. See our show last week, The Man Who Saw the Future, and how all this was set up, how it was all exposed in the mid-80s. Yet here we are today, and the human race have devolved even further. It's quite an interesting thing as to how successful very simple propaganda has become. With the addition of hypnotic editing and sort of mood-altering music, along with the even more hypnotic flicker rate, the television is the best form of warfare. It can make the public believe anything. Like a coup could be staged with 5 actors and a cameraman. Just think about it. You upload that to the agencies for distribution worldwide and it will be believed straight away. It's instantaneous. It's such a brilliant tool and obviously it's used all the time. But it can make the public believe anything. Yeah, absolutely anything. And basically, pictures of animals accompanied by statements of propaganda have proved very useful recently, haven't they, to enforce this apocalyptic narrative, which is the new church for control of the collective consciousness. Yes, David Attenborough and Netflix. 7 worlds, 1 planet. Yeah, all this stuff is amazing because as a filmmaker and someone who's working in this sort of media, it's fascinating what can be done. One of the great ways of looking at how powerful words and pictures actually are is to get a picture or get some video of someone with a blank face and just change the music underneath it and see what effect that has on the mind. It's very, very interesting because this is where the public are absolutely programmed with cognitive dissonance all the time. Basically, it's psychological warfare, and it's reached its peak with the announcement of a climate emergency and the introduction of psychologically controlled citizens' assemblies. That's the end of democracy. The citizens' assemblies are the controlling of the official narrative, as in every Stasi that's ever existed. It doesn't matter whether it's Chinese communism or Russian communism or any other dictatorship in the history of mankind. Citizens' assemblies are the end of all democracy. I mean that in the sort of Greek sense of the word, not in the sense of the word that we're told that it means these days, because it's lost its meaning. But the illusion is still real for many. The recent change of puppets in Parliament has had the mentally helpless crying in dismay. It's over the weekend. One useful thing that came out of this was the rejection by the public, right? This is what I think is a really good point that was brought up here. That the public have basically rejected Joe Swinson, MPs Chuka Umunna, Ruth Smith, Luciana Berger and Anna Soubry. Now, that is a victory for common sense, but there has been a victim of all this, and I'll get into that in a minute because it's quite important. But I'm not talking about Jeremy Corbyn either. There will be many more bought out and useful parasites to fill the shoes of these lot, though. Remember that. They're queuing up to join in the disenfranchised kind of fake left. We're going to be talking about that tonight. The control of information is complete now, though, in all news media. The Government Intelligence Services Psychological Operations Unit, known as the UK Guardian, is as near to complete fiction as counterintelligence will allow it to be. Because remember, counterintelligence has to have about 70% of stuff which you could actually verify as being in some way truthful. But with The Guardian, it's like it's 70% untruth with 30% of maybe even debatable facts thrown in. It's absolutely incredible, that newspaper. I mean, when the balance is tipped that far, you know you're living in a totalitarian police state, because this is an intelligence services operation, the UK Guardian. Well, the control of the narrative goes into the minds of the justifiably paranoid too. The so-called alternative to mainstream is awash with exaggeration and misinformation. Their priest class are as narcissistic and gullible as those who basically declare climate emergencies and read the counterintelligence of stuff like The Guardian. The only antidote to this sea of controlled nonsense, though, is like real analysis, which really takes far too long for the visually hooked soundbite public. Basically, it's got to be in the terms of and references of a soundbite. I mean, this idea of climate emergency is brilliant. You know, we had the post-truth world in 2016 as the word of the year, when it's in fact two words. And now we've got climate emergency, which is two words that don't go together, which is Collins Dictionary word of the year. Is this further proof that we're devolving? Yes, I think so. But basically the rapid editing and audio bombardment has taken its toll on the attention span of the public. Basically, this is the effect of television. The pictures which accompany most written and recited text have worked wonders in hypnotising the global village. And it was Marshall McLuhan who stated that the media was the message. He actually also got the term global village into the public consciousness. So all of this stuff about analysing the media and what it's really about, to me, is absolutely fascinating. But the media is a message, but is it the message? It's of no use unless it's analysed properly. And it's no particular interest in printing anything factual. We are in the post-truth world and the wilderness of the mind. The victims of propaganda, though, are being empowered by the likes of George Soros and the new fake left, and we're going to talk a bit about that tonight. In reality, it's just an arm of the global totalitarian police state. When the UK recently shamed itself with the use of these citizens' assemblies to bypass the appearance of democracy, I thought things couldn't get more terminally stupid, but I keep getting surprised, and stupidity keeps surpassing itself. Every week brings up a new low in the already below retarded hive mind of UK propaganda victims. Right? Now, a comedy of errors has descended on Downing Street following the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn and the installation of the Bullingdon Club raconteur and occasionally amusing Tory Chancellor Boris Johnson. Yes, the disciples of the George Soros School of Democracy and Critical Thinking have taken to the streets. Whose streets? Their streets. The bought and paid for, terminally dreary and completely out of date, yes, wait for it, Socialist Workers' Party have given out signs opposing Tory rule, despite Boris Johnson not actually ruling anything yet. A bunch of mindless drones shouted Brexiteers off our streets. Can you actually believe that this is happening in what used to be called Britain? Brexiteers off our streets. And that Boris Johnson was not their Prime Minister, despite all the evidence to the contrary, as it had already been announced. Now, but the failure of Jeremy Corbyn is the story of what has happened to the left, the old-fashioned left, the term left in its previous guise, which no longer applies. Corbyn was defeated basically by traitors and the Israeli lobbyists, and now he has gone basically and disappeared. All anti-Semitism seems to have disappeared with him, but I'm sure it'll be back. But what the good news is that Ruth Smith and Luciana Berger have actually been erased from the Labour Party too, and they need to find another target, and probably will, after they both defected and tried to make new names for themselves in areas where they thought they would get support. They actually failed to get support. That's in the case of Ruth Smith especially, which is very, very good news for what used to be called democracy. I mean, these people can't even muster support amongst their own fellow extremists, which is probably quite an encouraging sign. But the pitiful sight of these propaganda victims who are calling Johnston sexist, racist and homophobic is actually a brilliant example of misdirection. That concentrate on the issues of politically correct fashion and identity and leave the important stuff to the grown-ups. That's what they're being told to do, and they're acting accordingly. Basically, get back to worrying about your climate emergency and let David Attenborough and Netflix do their job. Now, I can't believe it. I was watching this video and it's just, well, I can believe it because I've seen it. I've seen this level of brainwashing over and over again. But one of these idiots who was being interviewed outside Downing Street said, "We can't give this bigot a free rein in this country." Said that it'd be spectacled and overprivileged pea-brain being interviewed in front of this rent-a-crowd of social justice warriors. Those who had been given their signs, basically, and instructions just before they joined the hive mind of the mentally helpless outside Downing Street. Now, these were given signs by the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, the Socialist Workers' Party's state-invented social justice warriors are the most mentally helpless generation in the history of Britain. Even in the 80s, when their presence was at all these sort of worthy benefit concerts, and these goatee-bearded, miserable, middle-class pseudo-Marxists were at their embittered and parasitic peak, even then there were other narratives and there was other form of debate available. Now they take over all narratives because they're funded by global governance. That's the difference between now and then. Then there was an ability to actually debate. In the post-truth world, there is no debate. But the fact that this shower of puppets still congregate under the banner of the Socialist Workers' Party is living proof that the present incarnation of Homo sapiens have devolved to the lowest possible level, even with the help of the education system. The globalists must be very pleased with themselves, really, when they're looking at this. I mean, it is like a cartoon. You couldn't make up how stupid these people are. But the sons and daughters, and of course the LGBTQ community of Soros and the World Bank Project know how to play their part in this. It's called the thesis, antithesis and synthesis, which is the New World System. The recently created fake plastic Bolshevik crybaby left, who repeat the globalist slogans given to them whilst holding up signs given to them and repeating what they are told, are the victims of the psychological society. These people are victims. The imprisoned minds of the state-backed antithesis. The imprisoned minds, yeah, that's a note I made. Yes, bring that one up. The imprisoned minds of the state-backed antithesis of the fake left is weak, ugly and very insincere. And I think that's the point. Where is natural law in all this? Where is truth? It's been absolutely destroyed by this evil totalitarianism. But they're perfect for manipulation. Now, this sort of mentality creates the likes of Jess Phillips, Chuka Umunna and their ilk, professional liars and low-level manipulators of the accepted narrative, manoeuvring themselves into position by endless virtue signalling. That's all these people ever do. Their only assets are their lack of morals and low-level cunning. And that goes for people like David Lammy too. Now, the old-fashioned left, this is what I wanted to talk about. It's quite interesting. I've been getting this from quite a few people recently, like the end of the left, the old-fashioned left. Now, I'm not into left and right. I think we're way beyond those kind of definitions now, and they're of no importance in the global governance system. But the old-fashioned left had some debating points and even principles, and these have been destroyed. though I never had much time for right or left. The pre-Blairite lefties could debate and had principles and even morals, and that's what I wanted to get onto and make a point of with this show. A good example of how the real principles and morals of the left have been destroyed is the appalling treatment of Derby MP Chris Williamson and the false and ridiculous claims made against him by these hate-filled fake left lobbyists. I'm just going to give you a quote here that was in an article which was basically gloating over the demise of Chris Williamson. It's from Justin Cohen. It says, Chris Williamson loses deposit, gains just 635 votes, not far off the number of times he was allowed to offend the Jewish community before finally being suspended by Labour. Well, Mr. Cohen, your ability to exaggerate and use false arguments and logical fallacies has been duly noted. Mr. Williamson was actually a lone voice of reason and even intellect, so had to be taken down. Even more dangerous, though, was his exposing of the Institute of Statecraft, which is this very shadowy organisation, which is a propaganda arm of the UK government, a little bit like the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, who were using fake anti-Russian propaganda. These people were going for Corbyn. So the thing is with this intelligence role of the government and its agencies is it has to cover the bases. It has to cover the bases that are needed at the time. And of course, the new intelligence narrative, which has been coming out of MI5 for the past 18 months to 2 years, is the rise of the far right, which basically culminates in articles in things like the UK Metro of two kind of rather hefty, beer-gutted, bald men looking out with binoculars over the White Cliffs of Dover. And when being asked why they were doing it, they said, well, we represent Britain first. And when asked what they were going to do when they spotted some illegal immigrants, they said, we're going to tell the Coast Guard. This is Dad's army. This is not the far right. I mean, the whole thing is an absolute pantomime now. But in a way, it's a very disturbing pantomime. But I'm going to go through an article now, which kind of was prophetic. Chris Williamson himself wrote this article, and it prophesied his demise. It's an article in basically the Communist Manifesto paper, Morning Star, on the 2nd of January. And in a headline, it stated, the chilling manipulations of the Institute for Statecraft are straight out of the Cold War playbook. Well, that's a pretty good headline and a pretty accurate one. Let's get into this article because I think it sums up what's actually gone on over the past 48 hours and has been going on over the past 18 months in the UK. As the prospect of a socialist government is now a real possibility, remember this was on the 2nd of January 2019, written by Chris Williamson, who's now lost his deposit as an MP. As the prospect of a socialist government is now a real possibility, it seems that vested interests will stoop to all manner of dirty tricks and smears to prevent that eventuality, says Chris Williamson. Well, Chris, you were right, and they did. Let's carry on with this. Over the past couple of months, Mr. Williamson says, I have been investigating the activities of the Institute for Statecraft and its so-called Integrity Initiative, after some of its dubious actions were highlighted in recently published hacked documents. They have registered premises just outside the Scottish village of Octomukty and an office suite in an exclusive location by Temple Station in central London. In response to one of my parliamentary questions on December the 3rd, Foreign Office Minister Alan Duncan said, the Institute for Statecraft is an independent Scottish charitable body whose work seeks to improve governance and enhance national security. Well, it certainly enhances national security. There's no doubt about that. Remember that national security is about the financing of the country and the controlling of the official narrative of the country. It's got nothing to do with the well-being of the people. That's a very important point. It says here, they launched the Integrity Initiative in 2015 to defend democracy against disinformation. Isn't that a brilliant propaganda statement? To defend democracy against disinformation, to control the narrative of public opinion. The problem is that this charitable body hasn't confined itself to that and has strayed into smearing Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, of course, along with other lobbying groups, which most people will have become aware of. These tactics resemble, he says, those deployed by the CIA in Operation Mockingbird that was launched at the height of the Cold War in the early 1950s. Its aims included using the mainstream news media as a propaganda tool. Mr. Williamson, you are an absolute prophet. How did you know this? How could you prophesy your own demise in these words? I'm going to read that again. Chris Williamson said, these tactics resemble those deployed by the CIA in Operation Mockingbird that was launched at the height of the Cold War in the early 1950s. Its aims included using the mainstream news media as a propaganda tool. Well, how could he have got it so right? Well, because he's part of the old-fashioned left, a man of integrity and principles with a functioning brain. Let's carry on with what it says. They manipulated the news agenda by recruiting leading journalists to write stories with the express purpose of influencing opinion in a particular way. Well, yes, that's what this show's about. Now it seems the British establishment have dusted off the CIA's old playbook and is intent on giving it another outing on this side of the Atlantic. The only thing I'd slightly disagree with here that Mr. Williamson is that they've always used this for the past 100 years. The British intelligence services have always run the British media. And of course, the culmination of that is the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is now basically just a mouthpiece for global governance. However, let's carry on with this. He says, interestingly, the mainstream media has been rather tardy in its coverage of the revelations contained in the hacked documents. These are the hacked documents that came out of the Institute of Statecraft. I would have thought, said Mr. Williamson, an international network of politicians, journalists, academics, researchers and military officers associated with this British-based project might have merited more than a passing mention on the BBC. Well, I think he's given the BBC a bit more credit than they're due there. But the fact that this charity has gone well beyond defending democracy against disinformation and is itself indulging in disinformation against the Labour Party and its leader seemingly isn't newsworthy to mainstream media editors. In my opinion, this is why Mr. Williamson has been taken down, because he's gone directly against British intelligence, and you're not allowed to do that. Even more so, he carries on, after I discovered through a series of parliamentary questions that since 2017, the Foreign Office has given more than $2.2 million to the Institute of Statecraft's Integrity Initiative. I think this is kind of nailing it, really, isn't it? Furthermore, a report on the Integrity Initiative by academics David Miller, Paul McKeague, Jake Mason and Piers Robinson was published last month, which revealed its funding sources also included Facebook and, wait for it, NATO. Their report set out the activities of the Integrity Initiative and makes for chilling reading. It refers to manipulation of the public sphere, including campaigns to smear and suppress dissenters and block their appointment to public office. Now, the reason I'm getting into all this is because it doesn't matter which side of the coin you're on. If you have integrity, which Mr. Williamson clearly has, it doesn't matter whether you're on the old-fashioned left or the right or in the middle. It's got nothing to do with any of these. What we're actually fighting against is the duplicity of the state and its agents, the duplicity of its agents who are in government and who are running these government-funded initiatives and NGOs and charities. These are the subversives. The real subversives and the controllers of the narrative of the governance project for the state and on behalf of the state are the UK intelligence services and think tanks such as Demos, who are being instructed by the intelligence services to put out this narrative and to demonise the likes of anyone who has integrity. Therefore, why not call an institute with no integrity the Integrity Initiative? Basically, this is what happens, isn't it? You have to hijack the moral high ground. And the moral high ground has been well and truly hijacked. They are using the terms of the honest. The dishonest have entirely subverted honesty. That's the whole point. Their trade is treachery, and that goes for every duplicitous politician in the country, every lobbying group in the country that is working for a third party. Let's get on with this anyway. Basically, they're talking about blocking dissenters and their appointment to public office. Well, Mr. Williamson has been on the receiving end of this just recently. So, it carries on. They cite overt attacks on British politicians, academics and other critics of Westminster government policies, most notably on the leader of the opposition and his staff. The report also states that covert networks or clusters of journalists and academics are being established alongside a critical mass of individuals in think tanks, politics, government and the military whose work is mutually reinforcing. We've reported on every aspect of this, whether it's Momentum and Labour Zionism or whether it's the 7-7 Brigade, who are attempting to control the narrative on Facebook and Twitter for the British intelligence services and the British Army. We've reported on the ineptitude of the MOD in rolling this out and the description of it as a psychological operation against the public by the British Army. I mean, the MOD are always going to put their foot in it. Whatever happens, that is the comedic aspect of British intelligence. It's run by people who aren't intelligent. That's the whole point of it. But the downside of this is that they kill people and they destroy the righteous. So let's get on with this. These actions, it says, are not the charitable purposes set out in the Institute of Statecraft's Constitution. Well, there's so many of these so-called charities which are absolutely dreadful and subversive. Look at Hope Not Hate, who openly attack people and call them far right. They attack old age pensioners, groups of intellectuals who are debating basically anything outside the intelligence services narrative of totalitarianism. There are so many of these so-called charities. The Charity Commission does not investigate them. It will not investigate them. And this is the point. I brought it up with the Charity Commission. Why are subversive charities who are destroying British democracy allowed to keep their trustees private and out of the public domain when all charities have to keep their trustees' names public? I know this because I've been attacked as being a trustee of a struggling tiny charity. And my name has been smeared along with other people's for a small charity that was helping people in London, putting on little gigs for people, putting on poetry nights for people with mental illness. This is the sort of thing the state wants to destroy because they have to control the narrative. However, let's get back to this. He says these actions are not the charitable purposes set out in the Institute of Statecraft's Constitution. In fact, they do not amount to any kind of charitable activity at all, which is why I have written to the Scottish charity regulator, which is now mounting an investigation. I wonder what came of that. But the efforts of this state-funded charity are not confined to Britain, says Mr. Williamson. I have recently written to the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez about the campaign launched by the Integrity Initiative last summer against the appointment of Pedro Banos as the director of Spain's Department of Homeland Security. The group's Spanish cluster succeeded in blocking Banos' appointment by relentless public hostility, and at least one Tory MP took to Twitter to join in the attacks, although precisely why a Conservative MP who represents the Isle of Wight should publicly seek to damage a candidate for internal Spanish governmental appointment is rather puzzling, says Mr. Williamson. Well, it's not rather puzzling when you are a lobbyist for an agenda. Mr. Williamson said, when I asked Alan Duncan what on earth a government-funded based charity was doing interfering in the internal appointments of a fellow European democracy, he completely failed to answer. What a surprise, eh? In fact, the government has rebuffed most of my questions about the Institute for Statecraft and the Integrity Initiative. Mr. Williamson, you have just found out you cannot go up against British intelligence. That is why you lost your seat. That is what they did to you. A Labour MP with as much integrity as you is going to be destroyed by the likes of the Integrity Initiative. That's what they're all about. He says ministers respond by saying things like documents and correspondence about projects within the programme will not be published, as this information could then be used to actively attempt to disrupt and undermine the programme's effectiveness. This is Stasi speak. This is the state closing down all narratives and controlling all narratives. This is what you get when you question who is actually running the country. We're not talking about Boris Johnson. We're not talking about Jeremy Corbyn. We're talking about those who run the country, the lobbyists who run, finance and direct the country. Nothing to do with politicians. He carries on. Consequently, I tried to obtain some answers directly from the people behind this charity, and so last month I visited both premises in Scotland and London. And you can see this. He was actually filmed when he got the door slammed in his face. He says, I arrived at the address in Auchtermuchty, which is in Scotland, after dark to find it is located at the end of an isolated dirt track. When I reached the building, I was confronted by a semi-derelict mill. I spoke to some of the businesses based there, but none of them had heard of the Institute for Statecraft. This is brilliant, isn't it? When I visited their office in London the following week, the door was slammed in my face when I explained I wanted to ask some questions about their activities. Hardly the response of a state-funded organisation with nothing to hide. As the prospect of a socialist government is now a real possibility, said Mr. Williamson in January, it seems that vested interests will stoop to all manner of dirty tricks and smears to prevent that eventuality. That is why it's important to expose organisations like the Institute for Statecraft and the Integrity Initiative, because they are incompatible with open democracy. Goodness knows how many other bogus charities are lurking in the shadows, seeking to influence public opinion and damage the prospects for a socialist Labour government, says Mr. Williamson. So, I don't expect the smears to end anytime soon, but I intend to continue pressing for answers to try to get the bottom of this scandal. Mr. Williamson was correct there. The smears did not end until he was removed. Now, the worrying thing is that the public apparently fell for the state propaganda against one of the only real black brains that the Labour Party had left, and that is old-fashioned and principled, old-fashioned left politics. The left that has been wiped out by the liars and the lobbyists. On the other hand, those who call the general public sheeple, this is a very important point I wanted to get to, those who call the general public sheeple are often no better than those they smear. This is also a big problem with so-called alternative media, which is as susceptible to state interference and state-controlled narratives than any other form of media, because all media is influenced by media. And there is a tendency for alternative media to jump on promoted bandwagons just the same as any other form of media, and they often entirely miss the point as much as the puppets holding placards printed them by Soros. Basically, there's another thing I wanted to bring up, sort of along with this, is that the belief that local councils or central government will act in any way towards the public interest by simply asking them to is misunderstanding the nature of governance. The only way to get any response which is in the general interest is to cleverly use the system. Now, Mr. Williamson went up against the system. Inadvertently, he confronted British intelligence, and look what happened to him. Therefore, there can be no resolution or success if people go up against the very system which is creating the narratives to control everything that they are doing. It takes a new renaissance of thinkers. And remember that the hive mind has been so programmed now that thinking is a rarity. There are very few people who can think critically left. So it would take critical thinkers to get together, form small cells of people and not raise themselves too much above the parapet. In other words, use decoys. Start actually having some fun with this and going against the state narratives, using the same machinations that the state is using against them. This is what Saul Alinsky did in his Rules for Radicals. And remember, David Cameron promoted the use of Saul Alinsky Rules for Radicals along with Obama. So this is part of the state. So why not use the state's techniques against those who are destroying our rights and inalienable rights, more importantly. Yeah, just a bit of a thought there. Now, this actually happened. We did have some success with this. We did a show called London's Dystopia, Public Winning Fight Back, which had quite a few interesting voices included in it. It was a public meeting, and the taking down of the Haringey development vehicle, which was basically where the leader of Haringey Council had to resign because of self-interest, was quite a step forward in this direction. And this, I think, is the key. These puppets have to be held accountable, but properly accountable, and have to be held properly accountable within the law. And that's not lobbying your local council. That's not writing generalised letters and basically getting lip service from these ridiculous puppets, which is all you ever get. None of these MPs, in my experience, have ever been of any help whatsoever. And none of them can be of any help because they have no power. The only power they have is what is given to them by the state. And the state can take that power off them very quickly, as Chris Williamson found out. But basically, yeah, the type of pressure the fake left apply, the type of pressure that is used by the public administration sector against the public, the Saul Alinsky rules, the fake radical far left, could be applied onto the state agents who are fighting against the public's interest. So basically use the Saul Alinsky principles. Never let up the pressure. Don't send letters of appeal. Scare the living daylights out of them and keep doing it. This could be fun, couldn't it? The only antidote is the return of critical thinking, deep analysis and contemplation before action. That's very, very important. Deep analysis and contemplation before action is the only way you can get results. It's the only way I've ever had a result, actually, by letting the enemy expose themselves, as in, let's have a look at your legal argument. Let's see what you're putting into my letterbox before we go to court. Oh, your skeleton argument isn't going to stand up in court. These are the sort of things that are useful, generalised motions which are being put forward by community pressure groups are going straight back into the system. It's the use of energy. Let's drain the energy out of you before we impose the intended outcome. And that's what citizens' assemblies are all about, as was proved in Oxford several weeks ago, when people there voted to retrofit their houses up to £25,000. That's the starting point. They're going to retrofit their houses and spend £25,000 on them, get themselves into debt or lose their houses, and they agreed to it. Now, what kind of brain would agree to that? Only a brain which has been so heavily propagandized it cannot think for itself or act in its own interest in any way, shape or form. This is the collective hive mind. This is the death of reality. And then we've got Gail Bradbrook. This is a fine example of the post-truth world. Gail Bradbrook, one of the propaganda industry's main promoted puppets, and the so-called leader of the so-called grassroots fake green Bolshevik revolutionaries Extinction Rebellion, who are backed by the new global narrative and its initiatives. Basically, this terminally dreary civil servant for globalization and the surveillance state, also known as Gail Bradbrook, another one who puts the word doctor in front of her name. Well, she pleaded not guilty to criminal damage despite being filmed committing willful criminal damage. This is a great example of the lostness of the mind, the world of feeling and belief, but no need for facts. The real damage is to truth and natural law, the subversion of what is true by liars whose slogan is tell the truth. We are in the post-truth world. They say act now, and they mean it, these lot. There is nothing of truth or value in their actions. That's the post-truth world in a nutshell. Basically, with UK villages, towns and cities falling over themselves to join in with this climate emergency, the UK is in its last days before the system is fully imposed. The opposition to unreality and lies can only come from a new priest class, a group of a few individuals who have truth on their side. This is where natural law and truth comes in. So all those people who are fighting amongst themselves and saying we're part of this media, we're part of that media, and these are the sheeple, are entirely missing the point. The only point of this, self-sovereignty, brings forth inner truth and natural law. And once those things are compromised, and once groups form and objectives are compromised, then you've had it. So basically, this is the most important point, I think, that's come out of this whole debacle of what's happened to Jeremy Corbyn and Labour. It's an absolutely brilliant example of the hijacking of principles and the hijacking of an agenda by propaganda agents. And that story of Chris Williamson, I think, is very, very apt. I thought that when I saw him on television, I thought this guy is going to be taken down. They cannot tolerate this level of honesty. And that's what happens. So, in other words, to actually get anywhere, there has to be inner integrity, but there has to be a strategy. And what I don't see is strategy. I see people wasting their energies in different directions, but I don't see solutions. And solutions can actually be found to things. And it does take a new kind of renaissance of a priest class of people who can think critically, who know what logical fallacies are, who know what false arguments are, and do not get trapped into them at any cost. And that is very, very rare. And it takes a lot of discipline, and it takes people who do not watch television, who do not listen to state propaganda, who do not listen to alternative forms of propaganda either. I don't know how much time we've got left, but I wanted to get onto this. Proof that psychology is the refuge of the intellectually destitute. There's a video that's available, and it's called the International Summit on Psychology and Global Health, a leader in climate action. Now, let's just see what the cult of psychology has now joined in with. It's joined in with the biggest lie in the last 2,000 years. Historically, psychology has lacked a unified global voice, it says here, meaning its contributions and messages have been fragmented. To meet today's global challenges, psychology must be at the table. This summit, which was a psychology and global health summit, aims to elevate psychology's contributions to global issues, such as climate change, that no one association could tackle independently. Let's see what it says now. They've put together some sort of manifesto, which is a little bit like your local council's climate emergency. There is overwhelming agreement among climate scientists that climate change is occurring faster than anticipated. No, there isn't. That's not true. So psychology has once again got it wrong. It says caused in large part by human behaviour. There's no proof for that either, but that doesn't really matter in the world of psychology because nothing has to be proven. It carries on, in addition to the threats to our natural environment and physical health, climate harms mental health and well-being. No, what harms mental health is children being told that there's a climate emergency and they've got 12 years to live. That's what actually damages mental health. That's where psychology is now going to damage mental health further and make money out of it by counselling people who think there's a climate emergency. It says it can threaten a sense of personal and professional identity. How can it do that? If you've got a sense of identity, a real one, how can the weather actually threaten your sense of identity? It says it can impede social support structures and increase feelings of helplessness, fear and fatalism. No. Psychological subversion does that. It says both acute and long-term changes in climate have been shown to contribute to the loss of social cohesion and to even elevate hostility and interpersonal and intergroup aggression. Now, this is actually what psychology is very good at. Psychological subversion and the use of psychological manipulation is exactly what does that. And that's what your local council employs, using a thing called Delphi technique, using trained facilitators who are using psychological manipulation. So that bit is true. The loss of social cohesion and hostility and interpersonal and intergroup aggression is definitely helped with psychological subversion. It says psychological science not only provides solutions to encourage environmentally friendly behaviours, it is also important in helping people adapt to climate change. Have you ever heard anything as post-truth as this? Psychological science helps you adapt to climate change. Of course it does. Of course it does, because this is 1984, and this is Brave New World brainwashing. Their draft resolution, I've got time for this, stick with it, you'll have some fun with this. It says, whereas there is overwhelming agreement among climate scientists that climate crisis poses a serious global threat, is occurring faster than previously anticipated, is caused in part by human behaviour. No, there's no overwhelming agreement among climate scientists about that, so that's your first lie. Let's get to the next point. Whereas the resistance of some individuals worldwide to accept evidence of climate crisis reflects a variety of psychological, social, economic and political factors, including misunderstanding the relevant science, psychological threats of departing from the consensus view of one's peer group, deliberate exposure to misinformation, and concerns about financial losses stemming from addressing climate crisis. Now that is the biggest doublethink and reversal and lies that you could possibly put in one paragraph. So that all these associations of psychologists need to be given some form of training in critical thinking, because they clearly have not got the ability to even think. Now, this is psychological subversion at its worst. It says, whereas current research and public communications on the impact of climate crisis have often emphasised the major physical damage caused by extreme weather. Yes, that's got nothing to do with what they're calling a climate emergency. That's called weather, including floods, droughts, hurricanes and wildfires. Yes, they have nothing to do with climate emergency, which is a non-existent thing, which is a phrase that's been introduced by psychological subversion. Okay, and insufficiently addressed the increase of displacement, migration and conflict affecting those populations involved. Now, the only climate refugees are due to extreme weather events, which is nothing to do with global warming, which is what they're referring to here. So that's another logical fallacy. There's more logical fallacies in this kind of mission statement by these associations of world psychologists, and I've seen for quite some time, whereas climate crisis has a disproportionate impact on already vulnerable groups with fewer resources, including low-income individuals or those who live in rural areas, people of colour, women, children, older adults and individuals with disabilities. I mean, can you get your head around how retarded these people are and how subversive these people are? It says, whereas research shows that climate change-related events can result in major acute and chronic adverse mental health conditions and outcomes, including stress, trauma and shock, post-traumatic. You can't have post-traumatic stress disorder from something that hasn't happened. You can only have post-traumatic stress disorder from something that's happened and gone into your nervous system. And I have studied this stuff. This is an absolute disgrace. These people are the enemy of humanity. It says, and other forms of anxiety, depression, which of course they treat through their other arm, which is psychiatry, which is the big pharma arm of psychology, and substance use disorder, which have been a secondary consideration in climate change communication and action. Therefore, let's see what they say. Therefore, be it resolved that our psychology organisations will advocate for and support international and cross-disciplinary collaboration to mitigate and facilitate adaptation to climate crisis. These people are mentally ill. We will inform our respective members and the public about climate crisis, emphasising scientific research. You mean paid for lobbyist nonsense from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? I think that's what you mean. Well, if you're meant to be psychologists, why don't you look into the psychology behind global governance? And it says, and consensus, they use the C word, on its causes and short-lived and long-term harms and the need for immediate and personal and societal action. We encourage our members and other mental health leaders to be vocal advocates concerning the necessary preparatory and responsive adaptations to climate crisis and to invest more in research and practice in this area. You're going to make a mint out of this. You're going to make a mint out of all these people, all these children that have been traumatised by the likes of Greta Thunberg, the United Nations, and of course the granddaddies of it all, Maurice Strong and Edmund de Rothschild, who invented the scam. Basically, this is a massive industry. To get back to what I was saying at the beginning of the show, the psychological society is the most manipulated and helpless in human history. And those outside it need to start thinking and thinking critically, get back to inner truth and natural law, and basically reject all the lies, because the lies are coming thick and fast. Now, this was signed by the American Psychological Association, Portuguese Psychologist, Australian Psychological Society, Bahamas Psychological Association, Brazilian Society of Psychology, British Psychological Society, Canadian, Chinese, Cuban. It goes on and on and on. So every useful idiot and propaganda agent in the world has signed this on your behalf, ladies and gentlemen. So there you go. A slight deviation from the news there, which I think is a good thing. Thanks for that, everybody. Do please support us on Patreon and support our film, The Heretics of Smithfield, because the heretics are now the people who have the truth. Heretic meaning one who is able to choose. So those who hold up placards for George Soros, the Socialist Workers' Party and global governance are the hive mind. Those who have been destroyed by global governance, such as Chris Williamson, we need to support. Okay, a kind of macro version of what's going on, but I think an interesting one. That's it, and good night from me. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net.